This weekend is the 32nd weekend. There are three more Sundays in which our gospel guide will be that of Matthew. But the readings for this weekend, first one comes from the book of Wisdom, chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. The second reading comes from the first letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, and will offer us chapter 4, verse 13 to 18. I hope we'll, at the end of our little talk today, be able to look at that because it is a significant section of Paul's writing and of Paul's thinking. And the gospel comes from chapter 25, verses 1 through 13 of Matthew's gospel. Now, as I mentioned, we just have 3 weeks left to look at Matthew's gospel as the guide. And since last we heard from Matthew, you remember with celebration of All Saints, we backed up to take a section from Matthew's gospel from chapter 5, but we ended by the week before finding ourselves in chapter 22. So now, very quickly, we'd like to, and we're not going through everything, but kind of bring us up to where the reading for this coming week comes from. At the end of chapter 22, which you remember had been a series of challenges presented to Jesus, and the question had been asked, what do you consider to be the greatest commandment? And Jesus had responded, love God with your whole being and love neighbor as self. Now, chapter 23, and this is perhaps one reason why it is somewhat abbreviated for our consideration, even on the Sundays, is really a sustained polemic against the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, as I mentioned before, it is very important here to recognize that what is going on in this gospel, and particularly in this section, is a challenge to the manner of leadership which the scribes and Pharisees are offering to Judaism, and they are pictured by Matthew's Jesus as negative examples. They do what should not be done in the community of Jesus. So in other words, the message here is basically aimed at the community of believers that make up Matthew's community, not Judaism or Gentiles in general, but a particular Christian community of that time and at that place. And it's also important, I stop a moment here, we have mentioned this before, because no text, this chapter in the New Testament, has contributed more to the creation in Christian and wider imagination of the stereotypes that even today we use when we say Pharisee or Pharisaical, which generally is a byword for hypocrisy. Now, keeping again in mind that this is aimed at a particular group of believing Christians who have a Jewish background, and this is not an attack against Pharisees in general. We have mentioned this before, that after the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70, which had been a crisis time in the life of Judaism, that there were a group, and these were basically Pharisees, also known as the rabbis, who sought to recreate and to preserve the identity and religious life of people around the Torah, around the law, because the temple had been destroyed. So they were also pioneers in a certain way of reconstructing or developing Judaism. Judaism had lost the temple, the holy city, and in fact with the destruction of Jerusalem, with the Sadducees pretty much put out of a job, they had lost the priesthood. So there was the need for new leadership and a new way of continuing the tradition of Israel, and the Pharisees saw that as basically surrounded by observance of the Torah, which told the story of the great covenant that God had made with Israel. So the word that is brought out in chapter 23, again to mention this, is that the writer is saying, this is not how it must be among you. Among you as believers, there cannot be, kind of people over you, but really he was arguing for an egalitarian type of leadership. You remember, interestingly, that the Matthean community was to see every person as equal and to be respected, regardless of their social, political, or economic backgrounds. This in itself was rather revolutionary for the time. Not that it was the only community to do this, but certainly it was one of a rarity, rather, of those who were doing it. So what goes on in chapter 23, then, having given this whole background and the importance of the language? The language gets stronger and stronger against the Pharisees and the scribes' leadership. In other words, this community of believers, the writer who Matthew represents, do not like what they are doing. In other words, in fact, the kind of opening thought is, and it's important to see they don't break ranks with Judaism. Listen to what they are saying, but don't do what they are doing. And of course, we had that so often. In the course of this, in the opening verses of chapter 23, some of the things that you are not to do, this is interesting, that you are not to call people rabbi, which means, teacher. Why? Because you have only one teacher, and that would be Jesus. Do not call anyone father on earth, because there is only one Father, and that would be God. And do not call anyone masters, for there is only one master, and that would be the believers in Christ. Now, just as an aside, the term father has, of course, had some interesting derivations and interpretations over the year. Well, why would you call, for example, priest fathers? And isn't this wrong? And there are some Christian communities who really, for a number of centuries, have argued against this. But in argument in favor of it, this title, this honoring title of father, from very the beginning was given to the leadership of the Christian community. So in that sense, despite the words of the gospel, tradition would use it in another way. So I just call that to mind, because sometimes you hear that, it says in the scripture, don't call anyone father. Of course, we always have to be careful of too literal interpretation of some things, and don't we take some things literally when it's to our advantage, and then at other times, no, it's just a little literary kind of statement. Now, chapter 23, continuing from verses 13 to 31, so this is a significant part of this chapter, are 7 woes. And so each of the woes are leveled against the scribes and the Pharisees. And the gist of them is that they are paying too much attention to external matters and not enough to what is internal, interior. They are neglecting that. Now, this is typical of what prophets would do. And again, I've mentioned so often that Matthew sees Jesus as the successor of Moses, therefore as the great prophet. So prophetic denunciations were often leveled against the people. And so here are 7. And basically you can read them if you'd like. They always begin, woe to you, woe to you. They accuse the leadership of hindering the spread of the gospel by raising up enemies against it. They accuse the leaders of engaging in foolish little discussions over insignificant things like mint. How much do you have to use mint and the tithe on it? Little things, okay? Thank God none of us ever do that. Misplacing priorities is another concern. Pursuing external things to the exclusion of internal things. And finally, then really levels the charge against them. You have the kind of leadership who used to murder the prophets of old. Now, if this doesn't irritate the leaders a little bit, I don't know what did. And I think part of it was that maybe by doing this, and it's important to see how Jewish argument used to go, if you can get enough kind of riling up of the other side, perhaps they will see the point that you are trying to make. And then chapter 23 concludes in verses 32, 39, which again gives a final warning. So you can see that this whole chapter, why in some ways it's eliminated for our consideration, and needs to be careful that we understand it correctly, that it is not against Judaism, although it's been used like that, unfortunately, through the centuries, but is to a very specific group and a specific time in the life of both the Christian and the Jewish community. Now when we move to chapter 24, which again is we're leading up to chapter 25, it really introduces four major parts of the gospel tradition of Matthew. It opens, verses 1 through 14, with a prediction of the destruction of the temple, which are considered to be by Matthew signs of the beginning of the end time. Now, the end time plays a very important role, we believe, in Christian thinking, certainly in the first 4 or 5 decades, and even into the decades leading to the end of the first century. That Jesus would be coming again in glory shortly, and therefore the importance of being ready. And we will see that that characterizes both the parable we're going to look at today, but also the parables that will come in the next 2 weeks. So it's a series of sayings and events that point to this coming of the Son of humanity, or the Son of God. And this is a title, or more importantly, rather, not the Son of God, but the Son of Man. And it's a title which is found in the last canonical book of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, in which at the second half of that book has a vision of an end time, glorious coming, and seated on a throne will be one like the Son of Man. And this title is going to be used not only by Matthew, but also by Mark and by Luke as the title which Jesus seems to have used for himself and to be more regularly applied to him, of all of the titles that are included in the gospel. So you get these sayings about the coming. Now, what I'm kind of fudging a little bit around here is some of this same material is taken over from the first gospel, namely that according to Mark. And in a few weeks, we will be shifting to the Markan gospel, and that'll give us an opportunity maybe to fill in some of the blanks here, which for now we can just kind of quickly summarize. But the importance is the belief that the end is coming, and the essential message is be patient. Now, one of the concerns, there's an interesting term that appears in chapters 15 through 31 called the abomination that makes desolate. This is an interesting term, which interpreters believe was developed during the time of what was known as the Maccabean Rebellion, an event that took place between the years 175 and 164 before the common time. And there had been a rebellion because put into the holy place, into the temple of the time, by the leader who was known as Antiochus Epiphanes IV, say that quickly, see how far you get, had put into the holy and holy of places an image of another god. And this was considered to be terrible and had led to a major rebellion, which has great import in Judaism, and we will see this a little later on in our discussions, not today, but which results in the Jewish observance of what is known as Hanukkah. Also, though, we believe that the Emperor Caligula, who was the emperor in the empire world of Matthew's time, he ruled after Jesus, had also thought to put a statue of himself in the temple while it still stood. Caligula was emperor before the fall of Jerusalem. So you can see what this abomination that makes desolate to go into the very sacred sanctuary that belonged to God and to put something idolatric there was considered to be very terrible. Well, this kind of material, there is some development that Matthew makes that Mark doesn't, but as I mentioned, we will come later on to look at Mark's gospel because the first Sunday of Advent begins with this very section from Mark, and that'll give us an opportunity to look at that a little more clearly. So when we come now to chapter 25, the first of a series of 3 parables, which we will be listening to over the next couple of weeks, is the parable of the 10 maidens, or the ready maidens. And this is verses 1 through 13. This, by the way, is the second parable that emphasizes the vigilance in the face of delay. Now, there's a number of interpretations of this, but many interpret this. I suppose I should just say, you know how it is. The story goes. The story is that there are 10 maidens who come to get ready for the bridegroom when he comes. And 5 are called foolish and 5 are called wise. The bridegroom delays, and they all fall asleep, and then the noise is made, he's coming, and they get up and trim their lamps. 5 are wise because they brought extra oil with them. 5 are foolish because they probably didn't think this guy was going to take so long, but they run out of oil, and they ask the others, would you share some with us? And they don't. This is a kind of interesting kind of thing. So a lot of questions could be raised about this interesting story or this interesting parable. When the maidens go out to meet the bridegroom, where are they meeting him? Have they stopped to rest on the way? Do they fall asleep somewhere on the street or at the city gate? Why are maidens who have extra oil so heartless toward those who have none? Weren't these women friends or relatives to one another? Is it a cruel trick for the wise ones to send the foolish to merchants who surely would not be open at midnight? Why are the attendants of the groom all female? And if they were related to the groom, why do they call him Lord? And why does he not recognize them? So there are a number of interesting questions which you could raise with this whole parable. I'm going to say that basically it probably should be understood, as we have mentioned before, characteristic of Matthew, allegorically. In other words, there is a deeper meaning to this than simply this story. Now, we do not know a lot about the marriage customs of the first century world. We have put together a kind of composite description of the custom, which comes from the Greek, Jewish, and Roman tradition. So apparently marriage customs were not just exclusively Jewish, but also would be similarly celebrated around the Mediterranean. Marriage, as you remember, was basically a contract on two families. It was not a question you fell in love and then you decided, I think we'd like to get married. That sounds very modern, and it may incidentally have been a case back in the first century world, but not necessarily. In fact, very often the bride only met the groom the first time at the parents' house when they were starting this arrangement. So the elders of two families would get together because a marriage would enhance something of the family, maybe socially, politically, economically. So there were a lot of other values that were at work here in establishing marriage. So if you think about it, the marriage is really within families and tribes. They did not go outside. They wanted to keep it kind of vibrant within a relatively small circle. In fact, the ideal partner in a marriage was the first cousin of the father's brother. So either that was the daughter or son. That was the ideal partner. Now, I'm not sure it always worked out that way, but as best we can see, there were certain models that were being followed. So the fathers would arrange the contract. The mothers negotiated the terms of the contract. So it wasn't just as patriarchal sometimes as we thought. There were then two stages. So once this deal was done, two stages. One, the betrothal, which was held at the father of the bride. And she would remain in her father's house now for a year while the prospective bridegroom got ready to have a house for them, which was not outside of his parents' regime or area. So you didn't kind of move away to Rochester from Buffalo to get married. It just didn't work out that way. The second stage of this, and this period, by the way, lasted anywhere from a year to maybe a little longer. So it was an interesting period of relationship between the groom-to-be and the bride-to-be. Now, the actual wedding itself was a transfer of the bride to the home of her husband. And as I say, he should have developed a place for them to live by this time. So the groom would go to the home of the bride to complete the negotiations, and then he would bring the bride with him back to his house, to his father's house, to the new house that he had provided. But when he went to her father's house, they didn't want to end this negotiation too quickly, because that was a dishonor. If they said, all right, here she is, take her, go, well, then everyone would say, boy, that was quick. So negotiation, therefore, would go on for a period of time, but they didn't want, and negotiation, by the way, involved the dowry, and so always finances somehow got involved in here. So that's why now you have the incident that the bridegroom is coming toward midnight. So that would be the end of the day. By then, you had to complete the negotiation. So all of that is a little bit of what we can put together as the marriage custom of the Mediterranean world of Matthew and Jesus' time. Now, the 10 women, we sometimes call them virgins, but that's really not the word that is used here or the sense. They were women, by the way, who were not bridesmaids. They were young women from the groom's household. So if you listen carefully to this parable, the bride is never mentioned, okay? So they were probably young women in the household family of the groom, and they would come out to kind of be the entourage to meet and to greet now the new couple who this would formalize the marriage once they entered the house of his father. As I say, midnight also, perhaps there's some religious thought here, was the moment of divine manifestation. It was, if you remember a little bit, the hour in which the angel appeared in the time when the Israelites were leaving Egypt during the time of the Exodus. All right, so moving along very quickly here, and the whole bit about the lamps, I don't know how you answer that. I have a picture here of a lamp. This would be the kind of lamp that was used now. This is about 4 times smaller than the actual lamp, so it wasn't this little. But you can see they put the oil and light come out this way, and that would be we have found remnants of these archaeologically even today. So how to quickly finish this, the allegorical interpretation here is that the bridegroom is Christ. The 10 maidens are the Christian community waiting for Christ. The delay is the fact that the coming and glory of Jesus has not yet happened, but they should be, and we should be, prepared and ready. The rejection of the foolish virgins, again as metaphorically, will be met at the last judgment, and perhaps the foolish, and here you got to be careful how this is interpreted are the Israelites, where the wise are the Gentiles. Well, be that as it may, you maybe hear sermons about this this week. So that's not a total, but a quick look at this particular parable for this week. I'd like to finish up quickly by a word or two about the section that we're going to hear in the Thessalonian letter, which is kind of interesting because what we sense is the real reason for this letter that Paul wrote to the community at Thessalonica was, we know that Jesus is coming again in glory, and we will be ready to meet him when he comes. What happens, and this seems to be the gist of the letter that was sent to Paul, to my Aunt Gertrude, who died, and Jesus has not yet come. Is she finished off? She believed in Jesus. She believed in the resurrection. What's the story? And it's at this point that Paul creates an interesting image of what will happen. Now remember, Paul is a pioneer theologian here. He doesn't get out the catechism and see what they have to say about this. There is none. So now he kind of thinks speculatively. This is his first remembered letter. We pointed that to the Thessalonians. And he said, well, this is what's going to happen. When the end comes, Jesus will come down from the heavens, as he's coming down, there will be, and it's kind of graphic, there will be trumpets blown and angels singing, and those who are dead will rise up first, and then the living will follow them and come up to meet the Lord in the space between the heavens and the earth, and all will be captured or caught in the resurrected glory of God. So that's, this, and I mention this because the word that is used here is they will be snatched up, or some say steal. Well, that's S-T-E-A-L. I don't know how you steal someone. And, or taken by force. Some modern interpreters who like this have called this particular event the rapture. You may have heard that term. And it's the only place in the New Testament, really, where such a description takes place. Now, is this really what's going to happen? Well, does Paul know? No. But does he want to, and why he does this is he does not want those who have lost loved ones to weep unconsolably, because those who have fallen asleep will also be part of the grand reunion in the glory of the resurrected Jesus when it happens. And so often this particular little section of the Thessalonian letter is used at funerals. Obviously, it's very hope-filled, and that was the point that Paul wanted to say to his Thessalonian community. Do not be like those who weep without purpose, who weep into an eternal sadness. He's not saying we shouldn't weep, but he is saying, let it not be a grieving weepness that goes nowhere, but keep in mind the wonderful resurrection power that we will all become part of in the coming into the presence of the risen Lord. Now, there's all more interpretation of this particular passage of Thessalonians, but I did want to mention it because it is perhaps the key section of this letter. There is another section we'll hear next week, but this is really, I would say, the heart or reason, Paul's affirmation that everyone will share, who believes in Jesus, in the resurrected glory of the Lord. Thank you, and we'll see you again, I hope.